Hi, today I'm going to be talking about two perspectives in psychology. Firstly, the behaviourism movement. Behaviourism believes that all behaviour is learned, and they use the term conditioning, which refers to one learning from their environment. Humans are born with a blank slate, or Latin, which is tabula rasa, meaning that as soon as you're born, things start to imprint on you, and that's how you behave. You're based on those influences from then on. There are two streams of behaviourism we're going to talk about today: radical behaviourism and social learning. Radical behaviourism believes that behaviour comes about from stimulus and response, whereas social learning believes it's from copying and observing others and how they behave. Behaviourist psychology theories are based on lab-based experiments, predominantly on animals, and behaviourists believe only observed behaviour should be studied, and that thoughts and feelings and other things below the surface are subjective. Key assumptions of the behavioural perspective are that behaviourists believe psychology is a science and should be studied through measurable scientific experiments. They believe research can be carried out on animals as they learn from their environment also, and that human behaviour is majorly influenced by learning from our environment or conditioning. And this excludes the notion of other influences such as genetics. Key theorist in the behaviour movement, Watson, delivered a very famous quote saying, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and the race of his ancestors." Okay, looking at some theorists, Ivan Pavlov came up with a very famous experiment proving classical conditioning. He had noticed that when his dog was given his dinner, he would salivate, and noticed that there was no reason for this stimulus other than it was automatic. So the food was an unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation was an unconditioned response to that stimulus. He introduced a neutral stimulus, bell, and what he did was he rang that bell to prove that the dog had no conditioned response to the bell. Then he added that bell into the process of giving the dog his dinner. So the bell would ring, the food would be given, and the dog would salivate. And obviously repeating that over time, what he then found was as he removed the food, which was the original unconditioned stimulus, the bell stayed, and the bell still conditioned a response in the dog of salivation, which was really groundbreaking of its time, and showed how effective classical conditioning was. It's been used in lots of different ways for farming, where like herds of sheep have been attacked by animals. They've been able to create taste aversions in the sheep by adding hormones to make them taste off, and then create a taste aversion so that the packs of animals don't attack them anymore, and farming is safe. So that's a really good example of how it's used in the real world. We're going to now look at John B. Watson's study, the Little Albert experiment. They wanted to prove what Pavlov had done with dogs could work with humans. So they took a 9-month-old baby boy, Albert, and they exposed him to lots of neutral stimuli. So a rat, a rabbit, a little mask, some cotton wool, lots of things that were neutral that did not create any sort of response in Albert. Then they introduced a loud noise, which was a hammer hitting a steel bar. Albert's unconditioned response to that noise was to cry. He was scared, it made him jump, it startled him. Then what they did was they introduced, at the same time as that unconditioned stimulus, they introduced the neutral stimulus back in, and it was the white rat, which Albert had taken particular interest in. Introduced the white rat and the loud noise at the same time, and it conditioned a fear response in Albert. So they proved through classical conditioning that they could create a phobia in a small child. The experiment had a few sort of like different sessions that changed things up slightly, and one of them was that they proved the theory of generalisation. So after a while, after they'd established that there was a linked fear response with the rat, they introduced all the neutral stimuli again that the rat resembled, and found that Albert was still afraid. And so this is called generalisation, and probably a real life example of that would be if you've had a bad experience at the dentist and you're scared of the dentist, even if you then return to the dentist and go and see a different clinician, you still might be scared of the dentist. There were some criticisms of this experiment, namely there were some big gaps between sessions, so it was hard to know how methodical Albert's responses were and what actually worked and what the stages of exposure were. Also, he was the only subject in this experiment, so it was one individual child trying to prove a whole theory. And also over the 3.5-4 months that the experiment went on, Albert developed significantly as an infant. He went from being 9 months old to 12 months old at the end of the experiment. So there was also called into question what was an automatic response in an infant of that age. Lastly, Albert's mother withdrew him from the experiment on ethical grounds. They essentially created a phobia in a child and they didn't have the chance to reverse that condition response, so it has been deemed an extremely unethical study. Finally, we're going to look at operant conditioning under the behavioural perspective. So operant conditioning is the learning which employs rewards and punishments for certain behaviour. And Skinner created a study on operant conditioning using animals, particularly rats and pigeons, and he created this contraption here which has become known as the Skinner box. This chamber's got like levers, it's got a food dispenser, flashing lights, a speaker to emit loud noises, and some electric flooring to elicit electric shocks. And Skinner was looking to see if the animals could learn behaviour through reinforcement and punishment. So the examples of the positive and negative reinforcement that helped encourage behaviour was that the rats could push a lever to release a food pellet, and so by pushing that lever they were getting a positive reinforcement of a food reward. They could also push the lever to stop electric shocks from happening, and so that was an example of negative reinforcement because they were increasing their behaviour by stopping something not very nice. They also looked at positive and negative punishment, so where they aimed to decrease a behaviour by introducing a negative consequence. What Skinner found was that reinforcement was more effective than punishment in this study. The study also established that continuous reinforcement and partial reinforcement were factors. So when and how often a reinforcement occurred affected the overall speed and strength of the learning in the animal. So for example, in the beginning of the study, there needed to be more regular reinforcement for the animals to establish the desired behaviour. So now we're going to look at the psychodynamic perspective, founded by Sigmund Freud in the 1800s and early 1900s. And then the psychodynamic, so his particular branch of psychodynamic psychology is called psychoanalysis, and then the overall term is psychodynamic, which refers to Freud and his followers. Psychodynamic psychology believes that childhood experience affects our behaviour and personality as adults. They believe in the unconscious mind being a driver of our behaviour and the tripartite personality. They believe humans are animals with biological instincts and society has led humans to try and control those impulses. Theories within psychodynamic psychology are clinically derived, meaning that they come from patient therapy sessions alone. Key assumptions then: the unconscious mind drives the majority of human behaviour. We are unaware of our unconscious, which includes urges, feelings, thoughts. Adult behaviour is informed by childhood experiences. There are a number of specific theories, including dream theory, Freudian slips, the 5 psychosexual stages of development, and these are all manifested in the unconscious mind. It's a deterministic branch of psychology, meaning that behaviour is caused entirely by the unconscious and we have no free will. And theories are supported by talking therapy findings. Okay, so looking at these diagrams here, so we're going to look at Freud. Freud did lots of research into the unconscious and believed that the unconscious was the main driver of human behaviour. Freud believed that there were 3 states the consciousness, pre-consciousness and unconsciousness. So we've got here some thoughts and perceptions that are on the surface in the conscious, memory and stored knowledge that we can tap into for pre-conscious, and then instincts, fears and repressed and selfish motives as the unconscious. He also believed in the tripartite personality, the id, the superego and the ego. So the id is the instinctive, pleasure-seeking, innate part of the personality. Superego is the absolute opposite, is our morality based from what we learn from our parents and society and our conscience. And then the ego works between the two as a mediator. It's the mediator between the real world and the id, and trying to strike that balance. The 5 psychosexual stages of early childhood: oral, anal, phallic, latency and genital stages. And during each phase, Freud believed the tripartite personality is in a struggle and must balance out these internal conflicts. Personality is formed by the outcome of these 5 stages, and where a child has become stuck, or as he would call it, fixated on a particular stage, that can play out in adult life. So that's where we get the term anally retentive from. Then we've got Carl Jung. So Carl Jung and Freud worked very closely together until they became estranged, and they sort of went off and worked on their own theories. Jung still very much believed in the unconscious, but he took it another level and believed that there was a deeper level called the collective unconscious, which is a pool of shared knowledge and experience inherited from our ancestors across all cultures. So you can see here we've got consciousness, personal unconsciousness, and then the collective unconsciousness is that next level. He also believed that within this collective conscious and unconscious, there are common archetypes. I'm going to talk about 4 of those archetypes now. So the anima and animus. Anima is the feminine part of the male psyche, and the animus is the male part of the female psyche. And in context, the anima in men may contain ideas about how women should behave, let's say, within his collective unconscious, but then in his personal unconscious, there will be specific relationships he has with specific women, such as wives, daughters, sisters, etc. And that will inform their personal relationships. Then we've got shadow, which is part of the unconscious and is all the sort of socially unacceptable parts of what we think, such as envy, greed and prejudice. And it's also things that don't necessarily gel with our own personal morals. The persona sits within the consciousness and is taken from the Latin for mask. And it basically means the persona is how we present ourselves to the world and how we shift and change depending on different social situations. And a persona will develop from childhood into adulthood. And then we'll look at the self. The self is the unification of the consciousness and the unconsciousness in a person. And Jung believes that reaching that state of unification is called individuation. If a person is in conflict between their consciousness and unconsciousness and hasn't reached individuation, they will have psychological problems. So that picture there sort of brings it all together and has the self at the very centre of that. Okay, when we look at comparing and contrasting different perspectives in psychology, we look at different debates. So we've got nature versus nurture, which is this hereditary or environmental? So is this behaviour hereditary or environmental? We've got free will and determinism. So is our behaviour a matter of free will, or are we a product of other influences, either internal or external? Reductionism versus holism. So reductionism is to study one particular component, so very much the behaviourist perspective, or do we study the whole person, and that's the holism piece. And then research methods, empirical or non-empirical. Empirical evidence are theories that are tested using scientific methods such as lab-based studies and measurable data. So you can see here we've got the similarities. Behaviourism and psychodynamic perspectives are both deterministic. Behaviourism looks at that learned behaviour and conditioning, whereas psychodynamic looks at childhood experiences and memories and everything that's stored in the unconscious driving our behaviour. Nurture, behaviourism and psychodynamic approaches believe in nurture. And we go back to that Watson quote at the beginning of the presentation, which demonstrates that nurture, specifically in behaviourism. One difference is that psychodynamic perspective also believes in nature. So they believe that alongside nurture, there are instinctual drives that humans are born with and that drive their behaviour. Reductionism versus holism. Behaviourism is a reductionist approach. They're looking purely at external influences and responses and excluding factors such as genetics, whereas psychodynamic psychology is more holistic. It considers the different aspects of someone's personality, the different motivations, their childhood experiences, all of that can happen to them that makes their behaviour come to light. And then we've got the research methods, and clearly we've got behaviourism very much empirical based, and psychodynamic is based in the therapy room and based on subjective findings from therapists, so is non-empirical. Okay, so how does this all apply to the real world? So if we look at the contemporary issues, mental health and wellbeing, diversity and inclusion, and workplace and organisational issues, we can start to apply the different perspectives in psychology. So first of all, if we look at psychodynamic therapy, this has a place within mental health and wellbeing. You can go to talking therapy, specifically unlocks a patient's unconscious and helps them to understand what's going on and what experiences they've had or thoughts or feelings they have that are influencing their behaviour. And it can be applied for a multitude of conditions, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, substance abuse, but it isn't effective in conditions including psychosis, PTSD or OCD. Holistic approach, again, we talked about that earlier, but it addresses multiple contributing factors to why a person behaves the way they do. And psychodynamic therapy is believed to lead to long-term change because it addresses that root cause and doesn't just treat the symptoms of mental illness. The drawbacks are it's very time consuming. You're looking at a short term of at least 25 sessions, but realistically more like 50. And with that comes a big price. You're paying for all those sessions, so it's very expensive. It's also hard to measure its effectiveness. And you can argue that people don't sort of follow one clear pathway to wellness because they're constantly unlocking different things in their unconsciousness. Cognitive behavioural therapy is another talking therapy on the other side of the perspective. So this combines both cognitive and the behavioural approach, but it helps patients find coping strategies to deal with patterns of negative behaviour and thinking. And it's looking at the way you think and the things you do. It's suitable for a really broad range of conditions, anything from OCD through to hoarding. And it's a short-term and structured treatment where you can expect to be goal setting with your therapist and doing homework. Okay, looking ahead then to diversity and inclusion, we're going to have a quick look at the observational learning theory, which is within the behaviourist perspective. This theory believes that you acquire new skills and you change your behaviours through observing behaviour of others. And it has applications across a range of settings, including workplace and education settings. Albert Bandura did a famous study called the Bobo Dolls study, and in that study, Bandura's findings highlighted that children learn more through observing than being told. So how we apply this to diversity and inclusion is that when you are setting up a diverse or inclusive school or workplace, you need that to be role modelled. You need to encourage that desired behaviours in your children or in your employees by having a leader or a company director or a head teacher or someone influential that people look up to, modelling that desired behaviour and promoting the values that you want. Finally, we're going to look at workplace and organisational issues, and we're going to return to operant conditioning to do that. So behaviourism has some tried and tested methods that are used in schools and workplaces across the world. So positive reinforcement in the workplace and in schools, you incentivise and reward desired behaviours. So by providing a bonus or prizes or awards in a workplace, or in a classroom you would praise someone if they raise their hand, modelling the correct behaviour in the classroom, or for instance you could put stickers or a big tick in a workbook if the work's done well. Negative reinforcement, to recap, is to take away negative experiences such as micromanaging in a workplace. If someone's doing their job really well, they don't need to be micromanaged anymore, so they may feel spurred on to do more good work through taking away that negative experience. In a classroom, if all the work is done in the class, you can remove homework. Positive punishment, you stop a behaviour through punishment. So for instance, it could be a verbal warning or a scolding if you're in a school setting. If you sacked or fired someone from a workplace, that isn't operant conditioning because they have essentially stopped working and they can't then enhance their work performance. And then negative punishment is the last example we're going to talk about. So this is where you take away something that somebody wants or desires to punish that undesired behaviour. So for instance, it could be certain privileges at work, like a parking space, an early finish on a Friday, a bonus, a work lunch, or if you're in a school setting, if children are misbehaving with play equipment at break time, you could take it away. And that way you are punishing that behaviour and you're taking something away. So there you go. So that is an overview of the different perspectives in psychology, both behaviourism and psychodynamic perspective. Thank you very much.